What's going on, guys? Moralltach Monthly 40 has just wrapped up, and this was actually a very impressive Moralltach Monthly and online hat format tournament. We're going to get into all the details on how many players entered and what decks actually took the top spots. I have the top 9 deck lists for you guys today, and we're also going to look at the tournament breakdown as usual. And if you guys are interested in playing in some of these online hat format tournaments, then definitely go down to the video description and find the link for the Hat Alliance Discord server, which is where this tournament and many other online hat format tournaments are played, most of which are free to enter. But anyways, guys, let's actually get into the details of this event. Now, part of the reason I say that this Moralltach Monthly was so impressive is because this event had 76 players, which ever since I started covering these online hat format tournaments, that is one of the largest that we've actually seen. And I've been saying for a very long time that hat format is growing and more people are getting interested in the format. And this kind of shows that, 76 players is a bunch. I know some of these Moralltach Monthlies have got close to 40, 50, some hitting 60, but 76 players is really, really great to see. And so anyways, let's get into what decks actually entered this event. As we have the graph here, the most represented is obviously Artifact Traptrix, which had 15 players on that. This could be a handful of different variants, but usually Artifact Traptrix taking up the top spot. And what's interesting is the second place most entered deck is going to be Geargia, which does make sense, but that is still a pretty significant difference in the number. Usually these are almost even, but here we see, again, 15 Artifact Traptrix variants versus only 9 Geargia variants. That is kind of crazy to think about. After that, 7 Mermail. Mermail has been doing very well lately, and so seeing 7, especially when, you're expecting a lot of Geargia and a lot of Artifact Traptrix variants, that does make sense. After that, 4 Sylvan, which is actually really impressive as well. Sylvan is one of those decks that is a fan favorite, but you don't really see it represented that much, so very cool to see that. After that, 4 Mythic Ruler, obviously a very good deck, and again, seeing, it even with Sylvan is very impressive as well, and same with, there's other decks. I do need to look into this a little bit more. I'm sure maybe if we look into this lower part here, we could find out what some of those other decks are. After that, 3 Spellbook. I believe the last event I went over, there wasn't any Spellbook, so seeing that Spellbook is back in the mix is very nice to see. After that, 3 Madolche. Madolche had recently just won an event, and, before that, it hadn't really seen that many tops or anything like that for a while, so it's actually really good to see more people wanting to test it out. After that, 3 Bujin, again, being even with Madolche just kind of shows, Bujin is usually one of those decks that, again, is a fan favorite deck that is a very strong deck, so seeing that that's even with some of these other ones is pretty cool to see. 3 Artifact Thunder. This is another deck that people have really been pushing to get tops, and it is a very good deck, and there is definitely room for this deck to keep consistently getting in these events and getting improved upon, and more players actually trying this out. Really cool to see that. And 3 Evil Swarm. Again, another deck that's been doing really well lately. We're seeing so many different decks here, 3 players entering, so there are a bunch of people wanting to try this out, and I think the next one is also 3, which is Constellar Artifact, another deck that a lot of people really like. It's a really cool deck. Being able to consistently put up Pleiades plus have artifacts and stuff is always nice. After that, 2 Cyber Dragon Artifact, 2 Gadget, 2 Insector, 2 Lightsworn Ruler, 1 Fire King, 1 Firefist Traptrix, 1 Hero Beat, 1 Twilight, 1 Six Samurai. That's really random, and, I've shown off Six Samurai a couple times in hat format on the channel, and it's definitely a cool deck. It has some, possibilities, but with no gateway, it does struggle a little bit. 1 Frog Monarch. This was the spotlight deck for this month, so if someone were to get a top spot, they would automatically get their spot in the hat championships at the end of the year. I don't believe they ended up getting a top spot, unfortunately, and then 1 Badland Boxer. So out of this, again, a very good variety of decks, and a lot of people, 76 players. We're bound to see some good variety. Unfortunately, there was still no Infernity. I know people always want me to point that out, just because when you think about H.A.T format, a lot of people are afraid to actually play in the format because they think Infernity is just so dominant compared to everything else. But even looking at this, no one even brought it, unless it's one of these other decks, which would be weird given, Infernity is a very known deck. It does have tops and stuff like that in the format, so I would assume it's not going to be under this other category. But overall, you guys can let me know what you think of the top decks here, and looking at the top deck representation, so the decks that actually made those top 8 or top 9 spots, I believe, for this one, there were 3 Artifact Traptrix variants. We'll go into that a bit more soon. 2 Mermail decks made it, 1 Gadget, 1 Mythic Ruler, 1 Geargia, and 1 Sylvan. So a pretty solid mix of decks actually going and taking some of those top spots. Only 1 Geargia with, 9 entering, but then 3 Artifact Traptrix. So honestly, very good crossover in terms of the Artifact Traptrix, given there were so many. 3 in the top 9 is pretty solid, honestly. But anyways, let's actually see what those top spots actually looked like. So taking down the whole event was Riftwa on Gadgets, and Riftwa had actually, I believe, won the last Pleiades payout, I want to say, with Gadgets as well, and that event had taken place while I was at Nationals, so I actually didn't get to cover their list, so it'll be really cool to take a look at their list officially. I've seen their last list and stuff like that, so, but for the channel, this will be a first. Really cool to see that Gadgets is actually making some moves in the format. Second place was Anarchy. Sorry if I mispronounce any of these people's names, I'll just say that in advance so I don't say it after every single name. But with Mythic Ruler, so really cool to see that. Third place was Samu Pusteno on Geargia. I believe this was Geargia Hands, or I believe they're third place or fourth place, given it always shows like third and third, fifth, and then 8th, I'm guessing, is 9th place, which is kind of weird that they do that. But anyways, yeah, the Geargia Hands, I'm pretty sure. After that, Mermail. So again, Mermail has been doing really well lately, and there's been so many different variants. And here we do see, in 9th place was also Mermail. So we'll have to see how these compare to each other, and just in general, how they compare to some of the other lists that have been topping lately. After that, we have Falco here on Artifact Traptrix. I believe this was H.A.T, so like card car hand Artifact Traptrix. Next, there was Sylvan Spieler, who was on Sylvan, namesake of it, which is also really cool to see. Again, we haven't really seen Sylvan get that many tops recently, so it'll be nice to see their list, and they always are like throwing some spice in their list, so it'll be really nice to see. After that, we have Kirill, who I believe was on H.A.T. Don't quote me on that, we'll see once we actually get into the list, but this should just be hand Artifact Traptrix. And then there was Tempest, who I think was on Cat, so the card car Artifact Traptrix, and then Jay, who is on Mermail. Again, we'll just have to see how these all compare to previous lists and stuff like that. And congrats to all these players, getting top 9 out of, again, 76 players. And a lot of these players are very, very good players. A lot of the ones we see here are people who are consistently topping these events. And there's so many other great players in these tournaments who, may have not topped this event, but, in general, top a lot of other events. So we do see a lot of good competition and stuff. So again, I highly suggest going down to the video description and joining the H.A.T Alliance Discord server. It has almost 3,000 people in it, all there to discuss H.A.T format and stuff like that. But anyways, guys, let's look at that first place deck list. So here we do have the gadget list, and, this looks very similar to the last list they played. It might be pretty close to card by card. I'd really have to compare them side by side to know for sure, but again, I hadn't really shown this off on the channel yet, and so the things to kind of note with this is they are playing 3 green gadget versus the other gadgets at 2. Some people like 3 and 3. I'm personally a big believer in 2 and 2, and so seeing a bit of a mix is a little weird, weird, but at the same time, they're playing 3 green, I would assume because it's the strongest, though in terms of defense, I think it might be the weakest. But usually, if you're going to play one, I guess you would want to see the stronger one first if need be, and then just being able to consistently get into your gadgets is very important because it means that you can always sort of apply pressure. Other than that, I'm seeing a lot of one-ofs here with the 1 copy of Fortress, the 1 Gear Frame, the 1 Thrasher, and the 1 copy of Mermail. Really, these are like, it makes sense to just play one. If you only play 1 Gear Frame if you're only on the 1 copy of Fortress, because if you're playing multiple Gear Frame, then, if you draw into, for example, your Fortress, then it feels a little weaker seeing these, which you kind of want to minimize the amount of dead cards. And same with Mermail if you're not taking advantage of things like Dianea, and especially given, there's only realistically 2 search targets for this, being the Bottomless and the Trap Trick Trap Hole Nightmare, so this gains a little less advantage later on, outside of, for example, maybe special summoning it off Tin Goldfish or your copies of Soul Charge to be able to get your pops. Taking advantage as well of the Star Drawing, a really cool card. It can count as a level 5 monster, which I'm pretty sure they're not doing anything like that in this deck, but when it's used for an Xyz summon, it gives the Xyz monster the effect that you can draw a card, so really nice to pair with basically any of your extenders or, off of a Soul Charge, any other card to slowly gain more advantage. The game plan for this deck a lot of times is just +1s. If you think about the gadgets being able to search, that adds 1, or for example, again, the Star Drawing being able to draw 1, or the Mermail being able to add a Trap Tricks trap, basically, or I guess I should say not a Trap Trick Trap, but a normal whole trap card, so that's like a +1. The Gear Frame is a +1, so just being able to take advantage of those small micro pluses and then be able to make Xyz and just kind of overwhelm your opponent by making rank 4s and stuff over time is really nice to see. I'm seeing like a bunch of other like random one-ofs as well, seeing like the 1 copy of Lance, the 1 copy of Mirror Force, which is something that really throws players off, which is kind of funny, but I think we've seen that in the hero beat list that topped a while back, so kind of cool to see that. And other than that, it looks like a pretty solid list. I know for a while they had been testing with double summon over a lot of builds would be playing more copies of chain summoning, but I think I've said this in the past that sometimes chain summoning, you work way harder to get your chain links up than actually playing ideally, whereas double summon kind of does the same thing, and usually, the 3rd summon versus the 2nd summon doesn't make the biggest difference in that many cases, so seeing that they're actually on both is kind of neat and a little bit interesting in itself. But anyways, let's go through the card by card for this. We see 3 copies of Green Gadget, 3 Kageto Kage, the 1 Machina Fortress, 1 Machina Gear Frame, 1 copy of Thrasher, which I guess I should also note, I feel like this would be better in multiples, but at the same time, it's really only good as a starter because once you have an established board, this card becomes a lot worse because you have to have no monsters to special summon it, and it can't be normal summoned. So it actually kind of makes sense to just play the 1 so that you aren't seeing more dead cards later on once you have an established board. After that, though, 2 copies of Red Gadget, 2 copies of Star Drawing, 3 copies of Tin Goldfish, just a really good card to get monsters out of your hand, or at bare minimum, it does have 2,000 defense, so it's really good on the defensive as well. 1 copy of Mermail and 2 copies of Yellow Gadget, choosing not to play any hand traps in the main, which definitely makes sense because this deck wants to get going as quickly as possible, so having as much engine that actually works makes sense. For the spells, we see 1 copy of Chain Summoning, 2 copies of Double Summon, the 1 Lance, 1 Mind Control, triple MST. Make sure to deal with that back row in such a trap-heavy format, and make sure, your monsters don't get hit with things like Fiendish Chains or any of the sort of floodgates. From time to time, we'll see people playing the Vanity's Emptiness, and just a whole bunch of other stuff, and 3 copies of Soul Charge. For the traps, we see 1 copy of Bottomless, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, and 3 copies of Fiendish Chain. I always call this the Geargia ratios, which is something we've actually been seeing in a lot more decks. There was a couple Spellbook lists that actually played this ratio, as well as a handful of just other decks. This is becoming a lot more common, just having that mixture of Fiendish Chains and breakthrough skills. After that, the 1 copy of Mirror Force, 1 copy of Solemn Warning, 1 copy of Torrential, and the 1 Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. Looking at the side deck, they play the 1 copy of Cycle Reader, which makes sense, it's searchable, as well as 2 copies of Crow and 3 copies of Max C. Always a great ratio to see somewhere in the deck, whether that be the main deck or side deck. After that, 1 Dark Hole and 1 Dimensional Fissure. This deck can, play this decently well. Same with, like, we already see things like Macro or the Soul Drain, because there's not really that many grave effects or anything like that. Sure, you would kind of ideally want to have your stuff in grave to be able to make plays with your soul charges, but at the end of the day, this deck can definitely play under it, and it hurts a lot of decks more so than it'll hurt itself. After that, 3 copies of Deck Devi, really cool to see that in here as well, and 2 copies of Wiretap for the grindier decks. Looking at the extra deck, they play 1 copy of Dweller, 1 Karen Gorgon, 1 copy of Direwolf, 2 copies of Exciton, just having an extra in case you need it. This deck can spam rank 4s like no other deck, so really cool to see that. 1 copy of Cowboy, 1 copy of Gear Gigant, 1 copy of King of the Feral Imps. I really like the 1-1. I believe my list also did something similar, and I just think that, there's not that many points where you'd be going for multiple, so seeing that is really nice. I guess one other thing I should note with the double Exciton, now that I'm seeing the double 101 here as well, is they aren't on a copy of Emerald, which has been something that's like kind of interesting that I actually like, which is like you'd rather just play a second copy of the cards that you'd usually be putting back with the copy of Emerald than having to make an Emerald, put it back, and then get to the materials to make another. So that's something very interesting to note. Anyways, 1 copy of Lavalval Chain, the double 101, the 1 Ragna Zero, 1 copy of Black Ship of Corn, 1 copy of Rhapsody and Berserk, and lastly, the 1 copy of Crazy Box for skill drain decks, as well as, other cards here, deck devies and stuff like that. So really great to see this. Congrats to this player. Really cool to see. And let's move on to the next deck list. Next up, we have the Mythic Ruler list, and I'll be completely honest, everything about this looks very, very standard. Everything from the main deck to the side deck. Looking at the extra deck real quick, there's one thing that stands out to me, which is the double copies of normal Stardust plus the 1 copy of Stardust Spark. But at the same time, there are some builds here that choose to play Exciton just as an option. I've talked about it before. It doesn't come up that often, so it makes sense not to play that. And besides that, they're just playing the extra copy of Stardust. And so this list, for the most part, looks very, very clean. It looks very much so what you'd expect. So rather than, taking more time to talk about it, I'm just going to go through the card by card here and, we'll move on from there. So they are choosing to do the 3 copies of Blue Eyes and the 3 copies of Whitestone. Really, this is just a personal preference for a lot of people. Some people will go with 3 Blue Eyes, some will go with 2, and same with the Whitestones. Usually, if they play 2 copies of Blue Eyes, they're just playing an extra copy of Flamevel Guard. But by playing, 3 copies of Blue Eyes, it means that your trade-ins are live a lot more often, as well as when you go and send an extra card off of the copies of Dragon Shrine, so it makes sense. So 3 Blue Eyes, 1 copy of Flamevel Guard, 1 copy of Blaster, 2 copies of Card Trooper, 1 copy of Debris Dragon, 1 Mythic Water, and 1 Mythic Tree Dragon, 1 copy of Redox, 1 Tempest, 3 Whitestone, the 1 copy of Title, and that is it for the monsters. For the spells, the 1 Burial from a Different Dimension, which I guess another thing to note is some people don't play this, which I think is kind of weird not to. This deck needs its resources, and it can run out of resources kind of quickly at times, so I definitely like this. 2 copies of Cards of Constance, 1 Dark Hole, 3 copies of Dragon Shrine, 1 Foolish, 1 copy of Goldsark, 3 copies of Soul Charge, 3 Trade-In, and 3 Upstart. I guess one other thing to note is they are choosing to play the 3 copies of Blue Eyes, but they're not playing any copies of Silver's Cry, which we've seen seen pop up a little bit more in the builds that specifically play 3 copies of Blue Eyes, but here it seems they opted out of it. For the traps, they played 2 copies of Wing Blast, 3 copies of Skill Drain, and the 1 copy of Torrential. For the side deck, they played 2 copies of DD Crow and 3 copies of Max C, very common in the Mythic Ruler side decks, as well as 2 Fire Hand and 2 Ice Hand. We've been seeing this a lot more in recent times, but also even back in 2014, a lot of people did choose that ratios. After that, 3 copies of MST and 3 copies of Emptiness in the side, always being able to Spark Dragon lock and stuff is nice. So very clean side deck. I always like to see lots of 2 and 3 ofs, and that's what we see here. Looking at the extra deck, we see the 1 Azure Eyes, 1 copy of Black Rose, 1 Colossal Fighter, the Crimson Blader, the Scrap Dragon, the Star Eater, 2 regular Stardust, and 1 Stardust Spark, 1 copy of Felgran, 1 Heliopolis, double Draco Sack, the Big Eye, and the Giant Grinder. Overall, really great list. Again, not really much to say about it, so congrats to this player, and on to the next list. Next up, we have Big Bert's Mermail list, and, there's a couple things that stand out to me right away. The first thing is we've been seeing Mermail playing the copies of Aqua Spirit a lot more lately, except this one is actually doing what you would usually see with that, which is playing the copy of Abyss Osha, so that's really cool to see that that is popping up more. Unlike the last Mermail list that topped, this one is still playing the copies of Genex Undyne and Controller, which there's definitely nothing wrong with that, especially, again, when you're playing the Osha package and the Aqua Spirits. It does make sense to be able to get that ball rolling a little bit more, and as a result, they are, playing the normal ratios for the Atlanteans, or for the most part, the normal ratio of 1 copy of Dragoons, the double Marksman, and 1 copy of Infantry. Sometimes we see this at 3, and sometimes we see the Infantry at 2 copies and 3 marksmen, but we haven't seen like the craziest ratios from time to time. Like, this is very standard in a lot of people's lists, so nothing crazy there. But the one thing that is a little crazy is the 1 copy of I think this is Abyss Dine. I don't think, from all the times I've been going over these reviews, we've actually seen this in one of the top lists. I know back in the day I remember seeing this, and if I remember correctly, it has an ability to basically special summon itself when added to hand, and then it has an effect to like bring back a level 3 water, I want to say. Here, I'll see if I can click it real quick and get it. Yeah, okay, so it popped up. It is Mermail Abyss Dine, and it says when this card is added from your deck or graveyard to your hand by a card effect, you can special summon this card from your hand. You must control a Mermail monster to activate and resolve this effect. When this card is special summoned by the effect of a Mermail monster, you can target 1 level 3 or lower Mermail monster in your graveyard, special summon that target, and you can only use 1 effect per turn and only once that turn. So a really cool card, and seeing that is something, again, we don't really see that often, and it being a level 3 also works with some of your extra deck. For example, the Abyss Trite and the Tri-Edge Levia, you can potentially even hard make it at times, which is kind of funny because usually you're just summoning those off of your Bahamut Shark, and then at that rate you do get like the extra benefits of the Levia that you don't really see usually because it wouldn't have materials off of the Bahamut, so that's pretty neat as well. Other than that, I mean, they're choosing not to go with like what a lot of people would call standard, which is like, somewhere between 2 and 3 copies of Max C in the main. But other than that, it looks really good, and I already see that they are at least siding Max Cs, which some builds do like to do. Others will go with like Upstart. Here we're seeing that they aren't maining Upstart at all, or the copies of Max C, which makes sense if they're trying to make room for, say, the copies of the Aqua Spirit or the Osha or the Abyss Dine here. So it makes sense. But let's get into the card by card. We're looking at 2 copies of Controller, 2 copies of Aqua Spirit, the 1 Dragoons, the 1 Heavy Infantry, the 2 copies of Marksman, 3 copies of Undyne, the 1 Abyss Dine, 1 copy of Gund, 1 copy of Lead, 3 copies of Abysslind, the 1 copy of Megalo, 1 Osha, 3 copies of Pike, 3 copies of Teus, the 1 copy of Turge, which is also just another way to be able to add back the Abyssdine, the 1 copy of Moonling Glacia, and 1 copy of Tidal. For the spells, we're looking at 1 copy of Allure, 1 copy of Mind Control, and 3 copies of Soul Charge, keeping the spell count very low here. And then for the traps, we're seeing 3 copies of Sphere, 1 copy of Bottomless, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, and then the 1 copy of Solemn Warning. For the side deck, we see that they're actually choosing to side an extra copy of the heavy infantry, which is something I feel like I've never really seen either. Very cool to see that. It almost kind of reminds me of when people will like side an extra artifact or like an extra deck monster, where it's like you could technically just main it, but I guess if you need the space and you want to keep your deck at 40, it is a cool option to have. And there's definitely a lot of decks that this card is just generically good against, especially being able to send it off of Undyne as cost. Sometimes this can just out really problematic cards. 2 copies of DD Crow and 2 copies of Max C, keeping it very simple. 1 Dark Hole, 1 copy of Chalice. That's also a little bit different, but I guess if they had an extra spot and they didn't know what to put, that's an option, as well as, you know, if anyone was on Evil Swarm or something like that, having an extra card to be able to chain, for example, to the Infestation, or kind of, you know, have an extra way to play around certain other cards. For example, the artifacts can sometimes be a little bit pesky and stuff in certain situations, so having that is a cool option as well, I guess. 3 copies of MST, 2 copies of Debunk, 2 copies of Malcat, and siding the Torrential as well. This is a card that a lot of times you can see in the main deck, but I guess, you know, again, they are on the copies of Undyne and stuff, and there's just plenty of ways to be able to deal with boards and stuff. So, you know, siding that is also just, I guess, up to a personal preference in a lot of cases as well. Looking at the extra deck, we see the 1 copy of Black Rose and 1 copy of Leo. So again, another build that just kind of chooses not to play the Gungnir, which is all right. 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Bahamut Shark, 1 copy of Exiton, 1 Alucard, 1 Lavalval Chain, 1 copy of Levier, Dracosac, Mechwhip Engineer, Gaios, Abyss Trite, 1 copy of 101, 1 copy of Big Eye, and the Tri-Edge Levia, which is honestly a really good card. I always like seeing this because it deals with hands and a bunch of other stuff. Overall, really cool list. Very interesting to see those little bit of differences that, you know, we don't see as often. Specifically, the copy of Abyssdine is always nice to see. Congrats to this player, and let's move on to the next one. So here we do have the Geargia list, and it is Geargia Hands like I thought it was, and overall, again, this is just another one of those decks that, from a quick glance, it looks pretty standard. Nothing's really standing out too much. I guess the biggest thing that stands out to me right away is just the 1 copy of Breakthrough with the 3 copies of Fiendish Chain. How I mentioned before, a lot of times you will see usually on 2 to 3 copies of Breakthrough Skill and then 2 to 3 copies of Fiendish Chain. Here it looks like they cut down a little bit on it to what I would assume is play a copy of Blackhorn in the main, maybe, compared to like what a lot of people would do, or maybe even like playing 3 copies of Max C versus some might play 2, but other than that, it looks like a pretty straightforward list, so I'm just going to go through the card by card on this one as well. So here we see 2 copies of Firehand and 2 copies of Icehand, 3 copies of Accelerator, the 1 Geargiano, and the 3 copies of MK2, 3 copies of Armor, 3 copies of the Arsenal, and 3 Max C for the monsters. For the spells, we see 1 Dark Hole, 3 MST, and 2 copies of Soul Charge. Again, keeping the spell lineup very short and sweet with the 3 MST to deal with more back row. For the traps, we see 1 Blackhorn, 1 copy of Bottomless, 1 copy of Breakthrough Skill, 3 copies of Fiendish Chain, 3 Geargia Gear, just an amazing card, 1 Warning, 1 Torrential, 1 Trap Trick, Trap Hole Nightmare, and 2 copies of Wiretap. Looking at the side deck, we see the 1 copy of Cycle Reader, very standard, and 3 copies of DD Crow, so at least they are at bare minimum, since they are just maining the Max Cs, which some builds will prefer to main the copies of Crows. They do still have the 3 crows in the side when needed. And after that, we see 1 copy of Dimensional Fissure, 1 copy of Mind Control, the other 2 copies of Blackhorn, 2 copies of DNA Surgery, 2 copies of Debunk, 1 Macro, 1 Soul Drain, and the 3rd copy of Wiretap. So honestly, again, just really basic to the point, which is always good to see. It works, and it shows that it worked. Looking at the extra deck, we see the 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Emerald, 1 Direwolf, 1 Exciton, 3 copies of Gear Gigant, 1 copy of Alucard, 1 101, 1 copy of Ragnazero, the Acid Golem, Black Ship of Corn, Rhapsody and Berserk, Soul of Silver Mountain, and the copy of Zenmaines. List looks great, so congrats to this player, and let's move on to the next one. So here we have the H.A.T list, and honestly, this is another list that I hate to just kind of skip over someone's list because I don't really want to like downplay this achievement of them topping this, but the list just looks great. There's nothing really much to talk about. It looks pretty straightforward. Maybe the one thing I could say about the main deck is the fact that they're only on 1 soul charge when a lot of the H.A.T builds or the decks playing the hands will usually be on like 2. But other than that, like there really isn't much to say. Sometimes like 3 Call the Haunted is a preference over 2, and same with like playing multiple copies of Breakthrough Skill is something to note. But other than that, like the list just looks good, and so let's go through the card by card. They are choosing to play the 2 copies of Beagletech. Some will play 1. They are on 3 copies of Moralltach, and they are maining the copy of Scythe. Some people like this in the side, some people prefer it in the main, especially when you're already playing 2 Beagletech. Sometimes they will choose the option of Scythe or Beagletech, but here we are seeing that they are playing the full line of them, which again has popped up a little more in recent times. 2 copies of Card D. You don't want too many normal summons, but sometimes this card can just get you up in advantage very early on, so that's nice to see. 2 copies of Fire Hand and 2 copies of Ice Hand, 2 copies of Dianea and 3 copies of Mermail, 3 copies of Ignition and 2 Double Cyclone, 3 Duality, and the 1 copy of Soul Charge. For the traps, we see 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 Bottomless, 3 Breakthrough Skill, 3 copies of Call the Haunted, which also, now that I'm thinking about it, makes a little more sense given they are on more artifacts as a whole. 1 copy of Compulse, 1 Warning, 1 Torrential, and 1 Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. For the side deck, the 3 copies of Crow and 3 Max C, gotta love to see it. 1 copy of Dark Hole as the only spell in the side, 1 copy of Acid Trap Hole, 3 copies of Blackhorn, 2 copies of Debunk, and the 2 copies of Wiretap. All of that looks completely fine. Something I guess I should point out is now that I'm thinking about it, a lot less decks have actually been using the Nobleman of Crossout that we had seen for quite a while. So I guess decks are just becoming better against those decks in terms of how they play and stuff, and H.A.T in general is a very grindy deck, so it doesn't always really need that, especially with cards, for example, like Debunk is usually good against that type of stuff, or when you're playing so many Breakthrough Skill, then it kind of, in a way, just deals with the problem in itself in the main deck. But that's all I can really note with that. In terms of the extra deck, we're looking at 1 copy of Dweller, 1 Durandal, 2 copies of Pleiades, 1 copy of M7, 1 Gaia Dragon, 2 copies of 101, 1 copy of Ragnazero, 1 copy of Giant Hand, 1 copy of Black Ship of Corn, Volcasaurus, Rhapsody and Berserk, Heartland Draco, and I guess this is something a little bit different, is the 1 copy of Zenmaio. Usually you don't see Zenmaio as much in the H.A.T builds or the ones with the hands, but again, it really just goes back to the amount of artifacts they're playing, so that does make a little more sense. Personally, I really like this card. It comes up in so many situations, so really great to see. Congrats to this player, and on to the next one. Next up, we have the H.A.T list, and there's a handful of things that already kind of stand out to me. The first of which is being the 1 copy of DD Crow in the main, and as much as I want to say that this is weird, I do see down here that they are on the copy of Transmigration Prophecy, which is basically just the trap card version of DD Crow in a sense. It doesn't banish them, but it does remove them from the graveyard by shuffling them into deck. This also does work for your own cards as well, so it allows you to put back resources, which is kind of nice. The other thing is the ratio for the hands, which is 2 Fire Hand and 3 copies of Ice Hand. 2 and 3, or, you know, even if it was reversed, isn't the most uncommon thing, but I think what's interesting is usually you'd prioritize whichever your deck struggles with the most, and so it's kind of interesting to see that they are on 3 Ice Hand, given that the deck inherently plays a lot of back row removal, being the Ignitions and double Cyclones, though I guess at the same time, if we're looking at it from that perspective, the copies of Artifact Moralltach kind of deal with monsters, so in that case, they're kind of going with which they have easier access to, which, you know, the Ignitions and double Cyclones kind of get you into more monster removal in the sense, same with like Sanctum, whereas the Ignitions and double Cyclones kind of have to be hard opened on their own, so maybe having access to just more back row removal makes sense in that capacity, and the fact that they're siding the other Fire Hand shows that in some matchups they know that they're going to need the monster removal more, or even just to be a bit grindier. The other thing I'm seeing is this card right here, Magic Deflector, is a card that I don't think I've ever seen in a hat format list, so that's really cool. I know this has seen a play in a bunch of other formats. I can think like True Draco Zoo format and stuff like that. You see this and a bunch of other ones, just being able to stop basically any type of spell card for the most part, so that's kind of cool into a lot of different matchups, is something, again, you just really don't see. But other than that, you know, it looks pretty solid, so let's go through the card by card. Here we see kind of what I was talking about before with a normal ratio of artifacts, being 1 Beagletech, 3 copies of Moralltach, and they are choosing the Scythe over, say, a second copy of Beagletech, the 1 DD Crow, 2 copies of Fire Hand, 3 copies of Ice Hand, 2 copies of Dionea, and 3 copies of Mermail. After that, 3 copies of Ignition, 1 Dark Hole, 2 copies of Double Cyclone, 3 copies of Duality, and 2 copies of Soul Charge. So again, here's kind of what I was mentioning before, where usually the builds that are playing hands are going to play more copies of Soul Charge. For the traps, we see 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 Bottomless, 1 copy of Breakthrough Skill. This is also kind of a more normal amount, usually 1 to 2 in this deck, whereas the other build was on 3. 3 copies of Call of the Haunted, 1 copy of Compulse, 1 Debunk in the main. We've seen this a lot more in certain Artifact Trap Tricks builds, and personally, I think this card is just so good, so having the 1 is very nice. 1 copy of Solemn Warning, the 1 Transmigration Prophecy, and then the 1 copy of Wiretap. Looking at the side deck, we see the 2nd copy of Crow and the 3rd copy of Fire Hand, and then 3 copies of Max C for the matchups where that is relevant. Only 1 spell card. Again, usually spells are pretty low in count in terms of the side deck, and even in some decks, the main deck, as we've seen, the 1 Mind Control. After that, 1 copy of Blackhorn. Kind of interesting to see this as a one of, but I guess if they just needed an extra card, it's always a good option. The 2nd copy of Debunk, 1 Deep Dark Trap Hole, 1 copy of Dimensional Prison. My apologies. So a lot of random one-ofs kind of, and it's kind of nice to see, though I guess like Deep Dark makes sense. It's usually a sided card, though they aren't playing Acid Trap Hole, so that's a little different as well, I guess. The 2 copies of Magic Deflector, or is it Magic Reflector? It's one or the other. 1 copy of Needle Sealing, the 1 copy of Trap Trick Trap Hole Nightmare, which now that I'm looking at it, they aren't maining either. So that is actually kind of interesting. I completely missed that. For some reason, I thought they had it in here just because usually they do. But seeing that's very interesting as well. And then 1 copy of Wiretap in the side, so they do have 2 copies somewhere in the list. In terms of the extra deck, we see 1 Dweller, 1 Durendal, 2 copies of Pleiades, 1 copy of Digusto Emerald, 1 Exiton, 1 Cowboy, 1 Gaia Dragon, Lavaval Chain, 101 Black Ship of Corn, Volcasaurus, Rhapsody, and Berserk. They are choosing to play the Heartland Draco when they are playing the Cowboy as well, and the 1 copy of Tyrus. Very interesting list, really, really cool to see. Congrats to this player, and on to the next one. Here we have the Sylvan deck list, and Honestly, again, we haven't really seen Sylvan in that long, but for the most part, there's nothing that stands out too much other than, I guess, a handful of things. So I guess that's a weird sentence to say. But anyways, the traps, they're choosing to play 3 copies of Wing Blast. Wing Blast isn't like unheard of in Sylvan, though usually people will go with, we've seen stuff like Call of the Haunteds, as well as things like some people will choose to main Emptiness or Rivalry. But choosing to go with Wing Blast is kind of a cool way to look at it, as you're really wanting to get your stuff in graveyard. This is a soul charge deck, and sometimes if you have a slower start, you can just go with Wing Blast and stuff. It's a chainable trap as well, and it kind of gives you fuel for your Miracle Fertilizers and for your soul charges, as well as here we do see they are on the copy of Peacekeeper. Personally, I like this card in that deck as well, and you don't see it super often, but they are on some more of the ones. For example, they are choosing to play the Cherub Sprout, as well as just like in general, it's just one of those cards that you kind of can play if you want, but you don't have to. The other thing is they're maxing out on Martial Leafs and the copies of Komashrumo. We've seen Komashrumo sometimes at 3, usually you'll see it at like 2 of, and then with Martial Leaf, we've seen some people go as low as 1 copy, sometimes 2 copies, but 3 is like very excessive, but it's kind of nice. Again, it's one of those things where if you can get to Engine, then you're in a good spot. And the deck, you know, look at it. It has lots of 3 ofs, lots of 2 ofs, and it just looks, well, I guess not that many 2 ofs, but lots of 3 ofs. And it's just a very clean list. Also, the Super Solar Nutrient as a 1 of is kind of random, but it's kind of cool at the same time. And yeah, not really a whole lot else to say here. I guess Mistake is another card that you don't see that often, but this deck isn't really doing much adding to hand. A lot of it's just, you know, excavating to graveyard and then playing out of the graveyard. So that's actually a really good card. This card just stopping both players from adding cards from deck to hand. Except I'm pretty sure it's except by drawing, if I'm not mistaken. So things like Sylvan Charity would still work under that, if I'm remembering correctly. I can click on it real quickly. Except by drawing, yeah. So completely cool card to see there. Getting into the card by card, 1 copy of Blaster, 2 copies of Lone Fire, 1 Spore, 1 Cherub Sprout, 3 copies of Hermitry, 3 copies of Komashrumo, 3 copies of Martial Leaf, the 1 copy of Peacekeeper, 2 copies of Princess Sprout, 3 copies of Sage Koya, and that is it for the monsters in the main. For the spells, we see 1 Foolish, 3 Miracle Fertilizer, 2 Sylvania, 3 Soul Charge, 1 Super Solar Nutrient, 3 copies of Charity, 1 copy of Terraforming, and the 3 copies of Upstart. This deck can just keep going once it gets started. And lastly, the 3 copies of Wing Blast. Looking at the side deck, we see 2 copies of DD Crow and 3 copies of Maxi. This should be no surprise. 3 copies of Lance and 3 copies of MST in the side. Sometimes we do see Lances in the main, but again, it just really comes down to, it seems like for this event, people were just trying to make their deck see as much Engine as possible, and then anything else is just in the side when need be. After that, we have the 2 copies of Mistake and 2 copies of Emptiness for the traps. Overall, looks very clean and very good. Looking at the extra deck, we see 1 copy of Leo, 1 copy of Scrap Dragon, 1 Stardust, and 1 Stardust Spark, 2 copies of Alsay, 2 copies of Felgran, the 1 copy of Heliopolis, 1 copy of Dracosac, 1 copy of Mechwhip Engineer, 1 copy of Big Eye, 1 copy of Giant Grinder, and 2 copies of Araya. Honestly, again, just a very clean spread. This deck looks really, really nice, and hopefully we can see more Sylvan in the future, as it is, again, a fan favorite deck and a really cool deck. And so seeing this, you know, it's great to see, and I really like how this looks. I might actually go and have to test this one out for myself. But anyways, let's move on. Here we have the Cat deck list, and again, this one doesn't have that many differences in terms of what the deck usually plays. I guess the one thing that's standing out to me, other than like, for example, just 1 DD Crow, because in the past, we've seen decks, for example, like Geargia play like 2 Maxi and 1 Crow, or the vice versa ratio. I think the big thing that's standing out to me is they're choosing 1 double Cyclone, and in place of, say, another potential double Cyclone, they're actually choosing to play a Book of Moon, which I feel like we haven't really seen this that often, though at the same time, against certain matchups, Book of Moon can be really good. Like, take the Gadget deck, for example. If they say summon a Gadget and then go Kage, if you Book of Moon one of the monsters, then it kind of shuts them off of a rank 4 for that turn, given they have nothing else in graveyard or anything. So that is kind of neat, as well as here we see like 2 copies of Breakthrough and 2 copies of Fiendish Chain. That's a little bit different as well. But other than that, the main deck looks pretty straightforward. And speaking of that double Cyclone, I do actually, looking down, see that they are siding the other. So it was at bare minimum a consideration to still have that if need be. Other than that, though, it looks pretty good. Let's go through the card by card. We see 2 copies of Beagletech, 3 copies of Moralltach, 3 copies of Card D, 1 Crow, 2 Maxi, 2 Dionea, and 3 copies of Mermail. After that, 3 copies of Ignition, 1 copy of Book of Moon, 1 double Cyclone, 3 copies of Duality, and 2 copies of Soul Charge. For the traps, we see 3 Sanctum, 1 Bottomless, 2 Breakthrough Skill, 2 Call the Haunted. So finally, one of the builds choosing to play 2 Call the Haunted versus other ones were playing 3. 1 copy of Compulse, 2 copies of Fiendish Chain, 1 Warning, 1 Torrential, and 1 copy of Trap Trick, Trap Hole Nightmare. For the side deck, we do see the 2nd copy of Crow there, as well as 2 Fire Hand and 2 Ice Hand. So, you know, being able to swap certain things. For example, sometimes people will swap out, say, the hand traps when going first, or even sometimes card Ds. So being able to put in some of the grindier cards and, in a sense, board breakers is something nice as well. The 3rd copy of Max C, the double Cyclone as the only spell. Again, a lot of these lists have only had like 1 spell in a sense for the Hat and Cat variants. 2 copies of Blackhorn, 3 copies of DNA Surgery, and 3 copies of Debunk. For the extra deck, we see 1 Dweller, 1 Durendal, 2 copies of Pleiades, 1 M7, 1 copy of Emerald, 1 Exciton, 1 Gaia Dragon, 1 101, 1 copy of Ragna Zero, 1 Black Ship of Corn, 1 Volcasaurus, 1 copy of Heartland Draco, so choosing this over, say, a copy of Cowboy, 1 copy of Tyrus, and here, as I mentioned before, that Cat usually plays the Zenmayo. We are seeing the Zenmayo here. So again, really clean list, not that much variance, but, you know, if it works, it works. So congrats to this player, and only 1 list left to go. Last up, we have Jay's Mermail list, and Jay is someone who's done very well with Mermail in other tournaments, and, you know, while normally we would look at something like this and say, like, oh, Common Charity, that's really weird to play, they have, you know, topped, and I don't know if they won or got 2nd place in another event playing with Common Charity. I know they've definitely topped with it in their list before, so that's nothing too crazy. I'd say overall, the fact they're playing so many trap cards is a little bit different, and, like, Fiendish Chain is something you don't really see that often in Mermail, but here again we see like a 2-and-2 ratio, how I mentioned that has been popping up more, so that's pretty cool to see. And then other than that, like, I guess the Chain Whirlwind is something that I know they had sided in the past, but actually seeing that move into the main is kind of cool. It's something along the lines of when a card is destroyed by a card effect, you can destroy 2 spell or traps on the field, or that the opponent controls. Again, I'll click it real quick. Activate only when a card on the field is destroyed by a card effect. Select 2 spell or traps on the field and destroy them. So a really cool card in a way there. Just being able to basically pop an opponent's card, for example, maybe with like a marksman, or get one of your cards popped, and then be able to just clear some more back row is really nice. And this is one of those decks that usually will play a way to destroy back row, whether it's, you know, we see the 3 copies of marksman here, so choosing to very heavily want to be able to play through back row, as well as 3 MST and the 1 copy of Twister in the side. A lot of times Mermail will play like the Malcats and stuff to deal with back row, but here their choice was to more so go with the Chain Whirlwinds, which is also really cool. Looking at the card by card though, let's see, they played 3 copies of Controller and 3 copies of Undyne, so going with a slightly heavier package, making sure that Undyne will always be able to resolve, ideally. 1 copy of Dragoons, 1 copy of Infantry, again, just playing 1 copy. How I mentioned that is becoming a little more standard, though some people will still choose to go with 2 copies. The 3 copies of Marksman, the 1 Gun, 1 Lead, 3 copies of Lind, 1 Megalo, 3 copies of Pike, 3 copies of Teus, the 1 Mooling Glacia, and 1 Title. For the spells, we see the 1 copy of Allure of Darkness, 1 copy of Salvage, just a way to recycle some of your waters, which is always nice. I personally have come around a lot on liking Salvage in this deck. 3 copies of Soul Charge, and then for the traps, we see 3 Sphere, 2 Breakthrough Skill, 2 copies of Fiendish Chain, the 1 Common Charity, the 1 copy of Chain Whirlwind, and 1 Torrential. Looking at the side deck, we see 1 copy of Crow. A little interesting that they're just on 1, but I guess if it works, it works. 3 copies of Maxi, 3 copies of MST, and the 1 copy of Twister. The 3rd copy of Breakthrough Skill, the 2nd copy of Chain Whirlwind, 2 copies of Debunk, and 3 Lightmere. So, you know, obviously this deck wants to be able to have a good matchup against any sort of light deck, whether that be like Bujins or the artifacts or a handful of other things, Constellar, for example. Just a really good card. Looking at the extra deck, I guess one other thing I should note here is they are choosing to play the Leo in this build, which is always nice, especially given they are, you know, on 3 copies of Controller. You might as well take advantage of it with any of your 7s, as well as they're playing 1 copy of Vulcan the Divine. This is basically just a double compulse, 1 for you and 1 for your opponent, so just a cool way to add back some sort of resources and deal with opponent stuff, which also kind of makes sense with the Fiendish Chains, because you can bounce these back and then use them on your next turn. So pretty nice little tech there. But here we see 1 Black Rose, 1 Gungnir, so they are on the Gungnir as well. 1 Leo, 1 Vulcan the Divine, 1 copy of Dweller, 1 Bahamut Shark, Exiton, Alucard, Levier, Draco Sac, Mequip Engineer, Gaios, Trite, 101, and the copy of Big Eye to round it out. Overall, again, really cool. Always like seeing the little small random techs and stuff. The Vulcan Divine's really cool. I always thought this card had a lot of nice potential, but usually you only see it in, like, for example, like Twilight, and then 3.5x is Fire Fist, occasionally something else, but those are like the main decks. I think even like Blackwing from time to time will play that card, but overall, really cool. And again, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video. You can let me know what you thought of this event or these deck lists as a whole in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it, comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out, share this video with your friends, and anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.